The war in Ukraine is raging for close to 7 months now. Given the recent battlefield gains by Ukraine, the Russian troops on the ground are reportedly retreating. Now, the pressing question of the moment is, what would be the Russian President Vladimir Putin's next move? In recent weeks, it was widely reported that Ukraine has made significant regains in its northeast. It was also reported that the Russian forces retreated from several key areas. When the questions of the Russian retreat reached the Russian president, this is what he said.
Корректировке не подлежит. Генеральный штаб.
The plan of Russia's special military operation is not subject to change. The General Staff makes operational decisions in the course of the operation. Something is considered the key, the main goal, and the main goal is the liberation of the entire territory of Donbass. This work continues despite attempts by the Ukrainian army to counter-offensive. Our offensive operation in the Donbass itself does not stop. It is moving at a slow pace, but consistently, gradually. The Russian army is occupying new and new territories.
Последовательно, постепенно, российская армия занимает новые и новые территории.
And speaking after the SCO summit in Uzbekistan, Samarkand, Putin added that Russian forces are not in a rush. It's also interesting to note that the Russian president had sought to test waters with his Asian allies, but he got no tentative assurances during his meetings at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meet, which concluded on Friday. Both India and China have remained guarded. While Russia and China proclaimed a no-limits partnership, Beijing has now raised questions and concern over the conflict. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi also told Putin at the same summit that today's era is not an era of war.
आज का युग युद्ध का है नहीं और हमने फोन पर भी कई बार आपसे इस विषय में बात की है कि डेमोक्रेसी और डिप्लोमेसी और डायलॉग ये सारी बातें ऐसी हैं कि जो दुनिया को एक स्पर्श करती है। आने वाले दिनों में शांति के रास्ते पर हम कैसे बढ़ सके उसके विषय में जरूर आज हमें चर्चा करने का मौका मिलेगा। आपका व्यू पॉइंट समझने का मुझे भी एक अवसर मिलेगा।
Meanwhile, Putin's statement regarding his plans in Ukraine immediately led to speculation. Taking together the Russian president's words and the situation on ground zero, Western analysts now believe the Russian forces are setting up a new defensive line in Ukraine's northeast. The British Defense Ministry saying the line is likely between the Oskil River and Svatov. The UK ministry added that maintaining control of this zone is crucial for Moscow. This is because the region is transited by one of the few main resupply routes that Russia still controls from its Belgorod region, adding that a stubborn defense of this area was likely. Earlier on Friday, the US military intelligence chief said Vladimir Putin is arriving at a decision, stopping short of speculating over what that decision could be. The Pentagon's intelligence chief underlined that the Russian leader's next move will largely drive how long this conflict lasts. And there is also pressure from within. Some of the military operations' staunchest supporters are now calling on the Kremlin to scale things up in Ukraine. Hardline Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov lambasted the mistakes of the Russian leaders. He made the comments in a voice note to his 2.4 million followers on Telegram. The opposition, though largely weakened, has doubled down on the criticism. And that's not all. Some local politicians from St. Petersburg, Moscow and other regions have also called for the Russian leader to be sacked for the war in Ukraine. Some local representatives have even demanded charges of state treason against Putin and to be stripping him of power. They have cited a series of reasons, including Russia's military losses in Ukraine and the damage to its economy from Western sanctions. While posing no current threat to Putin's grip on power, the moves mark rare expressions of dissent by the elected representatives. Considering the domestic and geopolitical compulsions, the Russian president now appears to be in a tight spot. And the big question is, what would be Putin's next move? Let's go straight across now to Adam Schwartz, who is a political commentator. Adam, thanks for being here with us. I'm not going to start off by asking you to speculate on what the Russian leader's next move could be, because there's no way of knowing at this point. But how do you see the setback on the ground and the diplomatic setbacks in a way that the Russian leader has received playing out from here onwards?
Well, I think to begin with the diplomatic setbacks that he received, the summit over the last few days was really billed as an opportunity for Putin to kind of demonstrate that he had significant friendships by large powers in Asia as he pivots towards the region in the context of Western diplomatic isolation. And particularly the fact that China and Russia recently in February signed this, quote, no limits partnership agreement. However, really, we didn't see anything really indicating that we would see that kind of level of friendship. In fact, we saw a very sheepish-looking Putin that felt that he sort of had to publicly explain himself to the Chinese president through making a public acknowledgement of the comments and concerns that China had over Russia's war in Ukraine. So I think the fact that he felt that he had to do that publicly rather than privately indicates really the extent of the concerns that China has to do with Russia's actions in Ukraine. But I think it also, to some extent, shows that there is a limit to the supposed no-limits partnership agreement. And that really indicates that actually, even though China and as well India are not willing to impose costs on Russia because of the war in Ukraine, they're also not willing to pay costs for themselves. And so basically they're ensuring that through their actions they don't receive any kind of secondary sanctions from the West. So what we're seeing, instead of sort of primary support, we're seeing secondary support through the increase in oil and gas exports from Russia to both China and India. And in doing so, that really allows them to kind of provide that sort of support, but also do it in a way that is not going to harm their economies. But I think it is quite difficult, particularly ahead of the G20 summit, for Putin not to be able to demonstrate that he's got those significant friendships really in place where he wanted them to be, at least. In terms of the actual ground setbacks, I think they're very significant, both operationally, but also from a sort of morale perspective as well. The fact that the Ukrainians managed to take 6,000 kilometers worth of Ukrainian territory that was occupied by Russia in such a short amount of time is really an indication of the growing strength of Ukrainian forces, supported by Western weapons and, of course, their own mobilization, but also the kind of weakness and Russian military intelligence failures that we've seen, but also Russian military failures themselves. I mean, their forces are clearly depleted, their supplies are clearly running out. And, generally in war and conflict, it's significantly easier to defend land than it is to take it. So I think the fact that they've managed to take so much land back in such a short amount of time is really very significant in terms of where the momentum is going on during this conflict.
Let's also talk about the energy politics at play. The Russian leader saying that, well, if Europe wants more gas, it should lift the sanctions, denying that Russia has anything to do with Europe's energy crisis. What do you make of that?
Well, I think, this is partly reflective of the fact that Putin simply doesn't have that many options, in terms of what he could do to try to ratchet up the war effort to increase chances of some kind of Russian victory. He could force a full mobilization, but really that would take several months to do. And so really he's trying to play this diplomatic energy game to kind of force pressure on European consumers that would ultimately lead to pressure on European governments through basically trying to link the cost of energy that consumers are paying in Europe to their support for Ukraine. And I think ultimately we might see a much more significant intervention from Russia in this in the winter, of course, when Western and consumption of energy is much higher. But I think it's very difficult to see Western support totally buckling, and clearly the West has indicated that it is willing to pay a price economically for supporting Ukraine. And of course we see Russia try to mitigate some of the impacts of the reduction in the use of Russian oil and gas through trying to support its own pipelines and formalize its pipeline agreement that it has in Asia. Just a couple of days ago, the Russian foreign minister said that the pipeline that they are planning to build through Mongolia would actually fully replace Nord Stream 1. So I think clearly we're trying to see this kind of shift in momentum from ties between Russia and the West to between Russia and ties in Asia. But at the same time, Russia knows that these ties can't be rapidly forged. So it's really trying to exert any kind of influence over energy that it possibly can in Europe.
Let's also talk about the domestic pressure that the Russian leader is facing at this point. Some of the staunchest supporters of this operation of Russia in Ukraine are calling for the Kremlin to scale things up. There's also that voice note that was sent out by the hardline Chechen leader, Ramzan Kadyrov, lambasting the Russian generals for the mistakes that, according to him, have been made on the ground.
Well, I think just beginning with the final point, I think any kind of criticism of any senior figures in Russia is very significant. And of course, you're not openly allowed to sort of publicly criticize Putin. So instead, they sort of go indirectly through blaming generals. And we know there's been quite a high turnover of generals in Russia itself. So that's really a way that they can internalize criticism, but without sort of compromising themselves. But I do think, it's worth noting that, generally when we've had leaders deposed in Russia, over the last 100 years or so, it's really not been from sort of a mass civil uprising, but rather the sort of ruling class supported by the wider masses. And so I think, the most important thing in terms of trying to understand opposition to Putin in Russia is actually, who feels sufficiently confident that they're able to speak out against him. And that's why we've seen various local representatives in St. Petersburg and I believe in Moscow as well, speaking out against Putin and even calling for him to be to face charges, which of course very, very significant. I think that is also keenly watched by China, of course, as a very strategic partner to Russia, to see which way it's going, because ultimately China doesn't want to sort of tie its fate to a leader who they think may not be around in a few months or even a few years. So I think it's it's so important for Putin himself to still try to indicate that he's not facing any kind of internal opposition. So I think really the point when things could move very, very quickly is when we see a sort of momentum within Russia itself and lots of people, let's say the ruling classes, who see Putin as a strategic threat to Russia itself.
Adam, we are leaving it there for the moment. Thanks very much for being here.
Good to be with you.
WION now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.